America in the late 1800s was a different world. Small towns thrived on trust, neighbors knew each other, doors were rarely locked, and families slept soundly at night. There was a sense of safety, an unshakable belief that the dangers of the world existed somewhere far away, beyond the rolling fields and quiet streets of rural America. The railroads were the arteries of the country, connecting small towns to bustling cities. Trains brought commerce, news, and visitors from distant places, but they also brought something far more sinister, something no one suspected. That trust shattered in the dead of night as an unknown killer moved from town to town, leaving entire families butchered in their homes. No one saw him, no one heard him, but by dawn his victims were found slaughtered with the blunt side of an axe. The scenes were always the same. A family home, often near the railway tracks, turned into a slaughterhouse. No screams had been heard, no signs of forced entry. The doors were locked, but the killer had found his way inside. The weapon was always an axe, yet not the sharp blade, only the dull, crushing force of its handle or backside. And the strangest part, he always struck near the railway lines. He arrived in darkness. He slipped into homes undetected. And when morning came, he was already gone, vanishing down the tracks like a ghost. For years, no one knew that this faceless killer had a pattern. They only knew the fear that followed in his wake. The first documented case happened in a quiet Massachusetts town in 1897. The Newton family, George Newton, his wife, and their 10-year-old daughter were well known in their community. They lived a simple, honest life, their home sitting just a short distance from the railroad tracks. It was the kind of town where neighbors greeted each other by name, where the thought of locking doors at night seemed unnecessary. That is, until one fateful morning when everything changed. A neighbor, noticing the eerily silent house, stopped by to check on the Newtons. The shutters were drawn. The front door, oddly, was locked from the inside. Concerned, the neighbor knocked several times. No answer. The silence felt wrong. When authorities arrived and forced their way inside, what they found was beyond comprehension. George Newton lay just inside the doorway, his skull crushed by a single devastating blow. His wife was found in their bedroom, her body twisted in a way that suggested she had awoken in terror just before the fatal strike. Their young daughter, just 10 years old, was still under her covers, her head caved in from the same brutal force. The house itself was eerily undisturbed. Nothing was missing, no valuables taken. There were no signs of struggle, no broken windows, no footprints in the dirt outside. The mirrors in the home had been carefully covered with cloth, as if the killer couldn't bear to see his own reflection staring back at him. The murder weapon, an axe, was left behind, wiped clean of any fingerprints. The killer had taken his time. And then, as if he had never been there at all, he disappeared. At first, the authorities believed it to be a singular act of madness, an isolated horror that would never repeat itself. But as terrifying as this crime was, no one knew it was just the beginning. Because while the town of West Brookfield mourned, the killer had already moved on, and he would strike again. For years, the murders seemed isolated. A family wiped out in Nova Scotia, another in Oregon, then Texas, Illinois, Nebraska, each town, each family, a tragic anomaly, or so it seemed. The brutality of the crimes was strikingly similar. Each time an entire household was slaughtered overnight, the violence swift and merciless. There was no sign of forced entry, no shattered windows or broken doors. No valuables were taken, not a single piece of jewelry or money disturbed. The family dog, if they had one, was always killed first, ensuring no barking would wake the neighbors. And the murder weapon? An axe. But not just any axe. It was always one found at the scene, usually belonging to the victims themselves, and the killer never used the blade. Instead, he swung with the blunt side, delivering crushing blows to skulls, ensuring death in a single silent strike. Then came the most unsettling detail. The killer never took the weapon with him. He always left the axe behind, as if mocking the investigators, as if daring them to find him. And then, nothing. No leads, no witnesses, no suspects, until the next time. It took years for anyone to connect the dots. Law enforcement at the turn of the century was fragmented. A sheriff in Texas had no way of knowing about a similar crime in Kansas. There was no FBI, no national database, no coordinated effort to track a killer moving across state lines. And this murderer had a distinct advantage: he traveled by train. His method was chilling in its simplicity. He would step off at an unassuming station, blend into the crowd, and make his way into town. He didn't need to be seen. He didn't need to be noticed. He only needed one thing: a house near the railway tracks. Once he found it, he would wait, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. He would study the family's routines, watch the lights in their windows go out one by one. Then, under the cover of darkness, he would slip inside. He knew exactly what he was doing. His movements were silent, his attacks precise. He always started with the parents first, one swift, crushing blow to the head. Then he moved to the children, killing them in their beds before they had a chance to wake. By the time the bodies were found, the man from the train was already gone, riding the rails to his next destination. No one saw him come. No one saw him leave. Then came Villisca, Iowa. In June of 1912, the Moore family, father, mother, their 4 children, and 2 young house guests were discovered brutally murdered in their home. It was one of the most gruesome crime scenes the country had ever witnessed. The parents were killed first, struck down in their bed. The children followed one by one, their small bodies crushed beneath the force of the blows. The 2 visiting girls, Lena and Ina Stillinger, suffered the same fate. Not a single person in the house had survived. Just like before, the killer had used the blunt side of an axe. He had covered every mirror in the house. He had drawn the curtains, sealing the crime scene in darkness. And when his work was done, he had abandoned the murder weapon at the scene and disappeared into the night. It was a crime so horrific that it made headlines nationwide. Panic swept through the town. Neighbors whispered that a madman was among them. Local authorities scrambled for answers, dragging in suspects, holding trials desperate for someone to blame. But while newspapers obsessed over Villisca, few realized the chilling truth. This wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. Over time, the trail of bodies grew. The Bludgeoned family in Kansas, the Shomans in Colorado, the Burnhams in Illinois. Dozens of families slaughtered in the dead of night. Each time, the same haunting details. Homes close to the train tracks, doors locked from the inside as if the killer had been let in or had found his own way. Curtains drawn, mirrors covered. No robbery, no motive. Just entire families wiped out as they slept, the only sound in the night the dull thud of an axe meeting bone. Yet, without a central authority to connect the crimes, the killer remained invisible. A sheriff in one town saw a tragedy. Another sheriff, hundreds of miles away, saw the same thing. Neither realized they were looking at the work of the same man. He had no name, no face, no clear identity. But he always left the same message written in blood across the country. He was the man from the train, and he was never caught. For a century, these cases faded into history. The names of the victims were lost to time, their stories buried in old police reports and yellowed newspaper clippings. The world moved on. The Villisca murders became a legend, a ghost story whispered around campfires. The other victims, those who had died in the same manner, in towns scattered across the country, were forgotten. Their deaths were treated as isolated tragedies, random acts of violence that never led to answers. But then came Bill James, a baseball statistician with a sharp eye for patterns. James wasn't a detective. He wasn't a crime historian, but he had spent his life analyzing statistics, breaking down numbers, and recognizing trends others missed. And when he turned his attention to the unsolved mysteries of Villisca, something caught his eye. James and his daughter Rachel became obsessed with the case. They started digging, scouring newspaper archives, piecing together what had really happened in that small Iowa town in 1912. And then they found something. Similar murders happening years earlier in towns hundreds of miles apart. Had history completely overlooked one of America's first serial killers? The Jameses pored over crime reports, searching for similarities. They followed the blood-stained trail back through time, from Villisca to Colorado, from Kansas to Texas, from Oregon to Nova Scotia. The deeper they looked, the more they found. What they uncovered was staggering. Between 1898 and 1912, at least 14 families totaling nearly 60 victims had been murdered in identical fashion. All of them lived near the railway tracks. All were slaughtered with an axe. All had their curtains drawn, their mirrors covered. And all of these crimes had one thing in common. One name that appeared over and over again: Paul Mueller. Paul Mueller was a ghost. A German immigrant, a wandering laborer, a man with no fixed address and no paper trail. No one really knew where he had come from or where he had gone. He worked when he needed to, took jobs that required strength and skill: lumberjacking, carpentry, anything that kept him moving. And then, one night in 1897, he simply disappeared. Mueller had been working for a family in Massachusetts, chopping wood and doing odd jobs around their farm. He was an outsider, but a familiar one, just another hired hand trying to make a living. Until that family was found butchered in their home. They were slaughtered in their sleep, killed with the blunt side of an axe. Nothing was stolen. The crime was brutal, but not chaotic. It was efficient. And when the bodies were discovered, Mueller was already gone. The authorities searched for him, but they never found him. He had vanished into the shadows, slipping through the cracks of history. And for a time, the killings stopped. Then, just as suddenly as they had ended, they started again. Mueller's lifestyle gave him the perfect cover. He was a drifter, a worker who never stayed in one place for too long. He had no family to question his whereabouts, no permanent residence to tie him down. He was just another nameless face in the crowd, a man passing through. And every town he targeted, connected by railway lines. Trains gave him the ultimate advantage. They allowed him to cover vast distances without suspicion, to step off in an unfamiliar town, pick his target, and slip away before anyone even realized the crime had been committed. He had a system. He would arrive unnoticed, study his victims, wait for the perfect moment. Then, under the cover of night, he would strike swiftly, silently. By the time the town awoke to the horror, Mueller was already miles away, hidden in the anonymity of the next town, the next job, the next train. Had law enforcement pieced this together sooner, they might have stopped him. But in an era without coordinated police work, the murders were treated as isolated tragedies. Each town saw only its own victims. Each sheriff thought he was hunting a lone madman. No one realized that the killer was already gone, riding the rails to his next destination. Paul Mueller was a killer born in the perfect era. The early 1900s were a time before modern forensic science, before coordinated police work across state lines. There were no fingerprints to be analyzed, no DNA to trace, no national criminal database to link unsolved cases. Each town, each state, each sheriff was working in isolation. Murders were local matters. If a killer struck in one town and then vanished, he ceased to exist in the eyes of law enforcement. There were no warning systems, no methods of tracking a man who lived nowhere and belonged to no one. Mueller thrived in this world. By the time a town realized it had a murderer in its midst, he was already gone hundreds of miles away, blending into the anonymity of another town, another railroad station, another temporary job. And if he was ever arrested for another crime, public drunkenness, trespassing, vagrancy, no one would have linked him to the unsolved murders. He was just another nameless drifter, another man moving through America's growing web of railways. For years, he traveled in plain sight. And then, just as suddenly as the killings began, they stopped. By 1913, the axe murders came to an abrupt halt. For over a decade, entire families had been wiped out in the dead of night, their homes turned into slaughterhouses. The killings had spread across states, across borders, following the relentless path of the railroad. And then, without warning, the bloodshed ended. What happened to the man from the train? Did Mueller die? Was he imprisoned for an unrelated crime? Or did he simply change his methods, abandoning his signature weapon, slipping into history as an anonymous drifter? No one knows. There was no trial, no confession, no final justice for the families who had suffered at his hands. His story simply faded away, a shadow lost in the cracks of time. But the question remains, was he truly gone? Or had he just learned to hide in a world that no longer noticed men like him? If Paul Mueller was indeed the killer, he was one of the most prolific murderers in American history long before names like H.H. Holmes or the Zodiac Killer became infamous. He was a ghost, riding the rails, moving from town to town with no fixed identity, no paper trail. He struck in places where no one was looking, choosing victims whose deaths would never be connected. A killer of entire families, a butcher who left no survivors, no witnesses, no one to tell the story of what had happened in the dead of night. And for over a century, no one realized how many victims he may have claimed. His crimes were never neatly packaged into a single narrative. They were scattered, forgotten, buried in old newspaper clippings and case files, gathering dust in small town archives. Only when Bill James and his daughter Rachel began their research did the pieces of the puzzle start to take shape. But even with their discoveries, we may never know the full truth. How many lives did he take? How many families were erased without recognition? And did he truly vanish, or did he simply evolve? Even today, the case remains open-ended. There's no arrest, no conviction, just a long, blood-stained trail of broken families and unanswered questions. The records of his crimes were never properly linked, never cataloged into the profile of a single killer. And that is perhaps the most terrifying part. Because Paul Mueller didn't need to hide, the world around him did the work for him. The lack of forensic science, the disconnected law enforcement agencies, the scattered and uncoordinated investigations, all of it allowed him to disappear over and over again without suspicion. But one thing is certain. Somewhere out there in the forgotten records of small-town America, there may still be more victims waiting to be discovered. Families who never received justice, names that never made the headlines, murders that were written off as tragic, but random, never connected to something much larger. Perhaps Mueller died in obscurity. Perhaps he lived out his days free, untouched by the law. Or perhaps someone else took his place, learning from his methods, refining them, carrying on his legacy. Did Paul Mueller really stop, or did he just get better at hiding? How many murders will never be connected to the man from the train? And worst of all, what if someone else right now is following his blueprint?